The briefing will come to order. Good afternoon. After my opening remarks and those of my good friend, Mr. Berman, the ranking member of the committee, I will recognize the chairman-designate and the ranking member-designate of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee, Mr. Smith on our side, Mr. Payne, for 3 minutes each. We will then move to our panelist presentation, followed by questioning by the members designate of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and I use that phrase because we're not formally organized yet, for 5 minutes each, followed by 5 minutes each for any other member who would like to ask questions of our panelists. And I appreciate the understanding and cooperation of our colleagues and look forward to today's discussion. And before we begin, I'd like to express what an honor it is to assume the responsibilities of Chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. For the members who will be joining the committee upon organization, please know that I do not take those responsibilities lightly. During the 112th Congress, this committee will be confronted with some of the most pressing national security and foreign policy challenges of our time, from ensuring rigorous enforcement of sanctions against Iran to providing effective stewardship of American taxpayer dollars in foreign aid and State Department programs, to instituting systems for accountability at the United Nations. I fully intend to work with all members of the committee and the American people to confront these challenges directly, responsibly, and effectively. It is therefore fitting that the first members' briefing hosted by this committee would be focused on Sudan. Today, Sudan is truly at the crossroads. Beginning on January 9th, millions of South Sudanese participated in a historic referendum to determine whether Africa's largest country would remain united or split in two, given the countless delays, manipulations, and violent eruptions that have imperiled implementation of the comprehensive peace agreement for Sudan over these past 6 years. Many doubted that this day would come. Yet the vote proceeded peacefully and credibly. After decades of repression by a genocidal regime in Khartoum and a war that left over 2 million people dead and 4 million people displaced, the people of South Sudan may at last have realized their right to self-determination. Unfortunately, the hardest work is yet to come. First, the results must be certified and accepted. Though Khartoum has pledged to accept the outcome, it has a long history of reneging on its commitment. The stakes are high, and both sides have spent the past 6 years preparing for war. Second, outstanding issues relating to the implementation of the CPA must be resolved prior to conclusion of the transition period in July 2011, including the demarcation of the border, citizenship and nationality, wealth sharing and resource management, including for oil and water, division of assets and debt, currency, and security arrangements. Third, the future status of the oil-rich Abyei region must be resolved fairly and in a transparent manner. Abyei is a lit match in a pool of gasoline, and continued failure to resolve its status all but guarantees war. Likewise, the popular consultations in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile must proceed in a manner that legitimately addresses long-standing grievances. These areas are awash with weapons and tensions are high. A single security incident could set the entire region ablaze. Finally, we must not trade peace in Darfur for independence in the South. Regrettably, it appears the administration may have forgotten key lessons from the past. Prior U.S. efforts to reward the Sudanese regime for signing peace agreements and acceding to the deployment of peacekeepers, while the regime simultaneously supported genocide in Darfur, blocked humanitarian access, and stalled implementation of the CPA, were broadly condemned. In the words of then-Senator Barack Obama in April of 2008, and I quote, "I am deeply concerned by reports that the Bush administration is negotiating a normalization of relations with the government of Sudan. This reckless and cynical initiative would reward a regime in Khartoum that has a record of failing to live up to its commitments, end quote. Yet the Obama administration is following the same misguided concessions-driven path. I do not intend to minimize what has been accomplished inside Sudan. Delivering a timely, credible referendum was an incredibly hard task. But again, the referendum is just the start. The true test of the regime's commitment will extend far beyond the July 2011 date and far beyond South Sudan. Thus, I am deeply troubled by the premature efforts to advance normalization, sanctions, relief, and debt relief. The bulk of sanctions mandated by Congress are linked to peace in South Sudan and in Darfur. Given recent developments in Darfur, the certification requirements for easing of sanctions cannot be met. I am particularly concerned by suggestions that the administration may remove Sudan from the state sponsors of terrorism list by July 2011. Removal from this list is not a gold star that can be afforded to advance an unrelated political objective. This is a serious matter with repercussions that directly impact our most vital national security interests. Recall that the previous administration delisted North Korea in exchange for nominal concessions relating to one nuclear facility. Almost immediately upon winning this prize, North Korea reneged on its promise to implement a transparent verification regime, withdrew from the six-party talks, and brazenly resumed its proliferation activities. Today, North Korea reportedly possesses one or more highly sophisticated uranium enrichment facilities, and according to the United Nations, is supplying Iran, Syria, and Burma with nuclear and ballistic missile-related equipment. The U.S. must proceed with extreme caution in our dealings with the Sudanese regime. The potential birth of a new nation in South Sudan is truly momentous and will have significant ramifications beyond the region. The United States has played a major role in bringing the parties to this point, and it is in our national interest to see that the process advances, advances peacefully. The risks are high, the challenges are daunting, but the achievement of peace in a region ravaged by war is an honorable endeavor. I welcome the opportunity to work with the administration and responsible partners for peace in Sudan toward this end. I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Berman, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you very much for calling this timely briefing. And I want to begin by congratulating you on your new position as chairman. I'd also like to congratulate the new subcommittee chairs, and I really do look forward to working with all of you in the 112th Congress. And at the outset, I'd also like to commend Africa Subcommittee Ranking Member Donald Payne and other members on both sides of the aisle for their leadership on Sudan, especially their efforts to focus the world's attention on the unspeakable atrocities committed by the Khartoum regime against the people of South Sudan and Darfur. Their work on these critical issues inspired two major pieces of legislation: the Comprehensive Peace in Sudan Act of 2004 and the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act of 2006, along with a number of resolutions condemning the regime for crimes against humanity. Madam Chairman, this past week marked a historic moment for the people of South Sudan, who fought a 22-year civil war to arrive at this moment of self-determination. While we do not know the official results of the referendum, it is clear the vote will almost certainly result in independence for the South. And as we consider this milestone, it's important that we remember the late President John Garang Mabior, who led the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and army through the long civil war, a terrible conflict that resulted in the deaths of over 2 million South Sudanese and the displacement of millions more. Before his tragic death in a helicopter crash in July 2005, Garang negotiated the Comprehensive Peace Agreement with Khartoum. That agreement provided for the referendum and other events we will examine today. After his election in 2008, President Obama undertook a bold review of U.S. policy toward Sudan and set out a new vision focused on intensive diplomacy. This new strategy required significant changes in behavior by the Khartoum government. It demanded verifiable progress toward a settlement between the North and South, as well as progress in Darfur. The President's new approach was met with great skepticism by many of us in Congress and the advocacy community, in part because it required direct engagement with a Sudanese government that had committed genocide and other gross violations of human rights. To carry out the new policy, President Obama appointed retired Air Force General Gratian as special envoy to Sudan. Gratian, the son of missionaries who was raised in Congo, assembled a team and developed a diplomatic strategy to realize the President's vision. Our first witness today, Ambassador Princeton Lyman, also deserves great credit for his diplomatic efforts to complete the roadmap that helped deliver Khartoum's final cooperation on the CPA and the referendum. Today, we can see the results of Obama administration's hard work. The voting for the referendum has taken place peacefully, and a major goal of the comprehensive peace agreement has been achieved. There are, of course, many, as the chairman said earlier, many outstanding issues to resolve before independence is finalized in July. A referendum on the status of the oil-producing Abyei region has yet to take place. An agreement needs to be reached on the sharing of oil revenue, the division of national debt, the delineation of borders. There is also the thorny issue of citizenship. Should the South vote to form a new independent state, there are fears that Southerners in the North and Northerners in the South could be left stateless and vulnerable to political violence. Finally, there is the crucial issue of peace in Darfur, which still eludes us today. We must not forget the innumerable atrocities that have taken place in that region of Sudan. In 2004, Congress and the Bush administration declared that the events in Darfur constituted genocide. And in 2008, the International Criminal Court indicted Sudanese President Omar Hassan al-Bashir on 3 counts of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of murder. I'm encouraged that President Obama has remained focused on Darfur and intends to revive the stalled negotiations between Khartoum and the rebel groups in Darfur. The people of South Sudan have taken a major step towards self-determination, but there are many difficult days ahead. The new nation will face a large number of challenges, from building the basic institutions of statehood to economic development to the reintegration of the returnees. And by all accounts, there is very little capacity in South Sudan to meet these daunting challenges. If South Sudan is to flourish, then the United States, the United Nations, and other members of the international community must continue to assist the people of that nation in their transition to independence and democratic rule. In this context, it is important to recognize the Herculean efforts of the United Nations Development Program to help make the referendum a reality. UNDP supported voter education, delivered ballots for more than 4 million voters on schedule, and helped to establish and equip nearly 3,000 registration centers and trained over 8,000 staff to manage those centers. These efforts and the efforts of UN peacekeepers in South Sudan underscore the extent to which the UN's work can support U.S. foreign policy interests and contribute to international peace and security. Madam Chairman, we would not be where we are today in South Sudan without hard-nosed American diplomacy, the active involvement of the United Nations, and targeted U.S. foreign assistance programs. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Berman, and I would like to recognize for 3 minutes each the committee designate, the chairman designate of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee, Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and I want to begin by joining the ranking member, Mr. Berman, and congratulating you on assuming the chairmanship of this very important committee, particularly at this very difficult time around the world. There are crises everywhere, and we look forward to all of us on this side of the aisle, and I'm sure on the other side of the aisle as well, in working with you in finding tangible solutions to the many vexing problems we face. So congratulations, Madam Chair. I also want to thank you for calling this extremely timely and important briefing to examine the historic events occurring in Sudan. I congratulate the Southern Sudanese people and join them in celebrating the completion of the referendum on the future status of their country. The UN monitoring panel of the referendum's assessment that the process was well organized and credible is particularly commendable given the serious time and resource constraints that preceded it. However, the voting last week marked only the beginning of what promises to be a long process fraught with peril. It will take several weeks for the votes to be transmitted from the nearly 3,000 referendum centers to county and state levels and onto Juba and Khartoum before the official results are announced. If the South has voted for secession, as is widely believed, then numerous complicated and potentially volatile issues remain to be resolved. Among the most prominent of these issues is the demarcation of the border, including the division of the Abyei region with its oil reserves and fertile land. The sharing of oil reserves as well as debt and the question of citizenship are some of the other major challenges still to be addressed. And the establishment of a permanent peace in Darfur remains a critical but elusive goal as violence intensifies despite the current talks in Doha. I personally am concerned about the return of reportedly large numbers of Southerners residing in the north to the south. I was informed during a hearing in September that humanitarian agencies at that time were not prepared to handle mass movements in Sudan. Unless this assessment has changed, such movements could lead to a severe humanitarian crisis and have a destabilizing security impact on the South. Those Southerners who remain in the North against their will is another deeply troubling concern. Beginning in the 1980s, Arab militias, armed by the Khartoum regime, conducted slave raids in the South, taking mostly women and children to the North to serve as labor and sex slaves. The 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement failed to address this issue, and an estimated 35,000 Southerners remain in the North in this state of forced servitude. This grave human rights issue must be acknowledged as a priority and the freedom of all slaves immediately secured. Finally, I look forward to hearing the briefers' views as to what the impact the referendum will have on the North, again assuming a vote for independence. The government of Sudan, to its credit, allowed the referendum to proceed and has publicly stated that it will respect the outcome, but given its abysmal track record, it is not a basis for optimism. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'd like to recognize for 3 minutes the ranking member designate of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee, Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much, and let me commend you for your ascension to the chair of this committee, Mr. Berman. And let me thank you for holding this very critical meeting on Sudan, being the first hearing, and I think it's appropriate. Let me also express my deep appreciation to the witnesses who are certainly among the most knowledgeable people on Sudan. Ambassador Lyman, who did a great job in Nigeria and South Africa during critical times, Special Envoy Williamson, who with the State Department and UN posts and was a great envoy to Sudan, and Mr. Ismail, who fled from Darfur and has been a great advocate for justice. Let me thank all of you for your commitment and self-determination to make this day a reality. Today, Sudan is indeed at the crossroads. The week-long referendum has just concluded, and by all accounts, the outcome is clear. The people of South Sudan has chosen independence. My friends on the ground during the voting process have relayed stories of remarkable moments that illustrate the hope and excitement that lies in the heart of the South Sudanese. A policeman, after voting, looked around and told people in line, "I crossed the river, come join me." A pregnant woman, while online to vote, gave birth and was later able to cast her vote for the sake of her new baby. As I reflect on the 20 years that I've been working with Sudan, I remember many pivotal moments of my own and the Congress struggle to see the people of South Sudan exercise their right of self-determination. I recall my first visit in 1993 to Nimali, a town near the Ugandan border, which was the front line of the struggle back then, helped mediate negotiations between two factions of the SPLM. It was then that I first met Dr. John Garang in the bush, father of South Sudan's quest for autonomy, as well as a young military commander, Salva Kiir, who was there at his side, who is now the president of the government of South Sudan. Upon returning from that trip, I, along with other members, introduced a resolution in the House calling for the right of self-determination for the people of South Sudan, and it passed this body. I recall over a dozen visits to South Sudan and the Darfur refugee camps in Chad, and with Representatives Lee and Wolf and Tancredo, along with Senator Feingold, Senator Frist, Senator Brownback, all dedicated members of this institution at the time. After one such visit in 2004, I sponsored a resolution to call the world's attention to the atrocities in Darfur, which passed the House overwhelmingly, the first time that the Congress recognized ongoing genocide while it was going on. I recall visits to Nairobi and Naivasha in 2004 and 2005 with IGAD and a negotiation that culminated in the signing of the CPA on January 9th in 2005 in Nairobi, where I witnessed that. I will ask that the rest of my statement be added to the record since the gavel has been hit, but I do agree that the ABA, I believe, should be solved before sanctions are released. We see what's happened in India with Kashmir, still a question. We don't want ABA to be a question 20 years from now with fighting going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as the new members will know, it's embarrassing to gavel down the gentleman from New Jersey and both gentlemen from New Jersey, because they are the leading experts when it comes to Africa. So we are well served by having Chairman and Ranking Member Smith and Payne with us. I'm sorry, gentlemen, for the time restraints. And as Mr. Payne said, we are very privileged to have two distinguished panels before us today. I know everyone is anxious to hear what they have to say. They are the experts, so I will only offer brief introductions and encourage members to read their biographies in full in your packet. We will begin with Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who has just returned from observing the referendum process in Sudan. The ambassador was appointed by Secretary Clinton in August 2010 to lead the U.S. Negotiation Support Unit in Sudan. Prior to his appointment, he was serving as an adjunct senior fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and as an adjunct professor at Georgetown. He has a long, distinguished career in government service, including postings as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria and South Africa, and Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. The ambassador has a PhD in political science from Harvard University and has published numerous books and articles on foreign policy, African affairs, economic development, HIV/AIDS, UN reform, and peacekeeping. Ambassador Lyman, the floor is yours. Thank you, sir. Could push that little button there. Somebody could help.
There we go. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you and the members, Ranking Member, Congressman Berman, and all the members here for holding this hearing and making this one of the very first issues of your chairmanship and of the committee this year. As you said, this is a terribly important issue. I recall Prime Minister Melis at the UN meeting on Sudan in September saying, and here's a man who faces a lot of crises in his neighborhood, saying that the peace process in Sudan was the most important in all of Africa. And it's an indication of how widespread the implications are of having peace in that area. Thank you also for the work that Congress has done on this issue, all the members, the legislation, et cetera. It's made an extraordinary difference to send a message to the people of Sudan how much the United States cares, not just about the politics and the strategic aspects of it, but the welfare of the people who have suffered from war during this long period of time. We had a good week, Madam Chairman. We had, as you described, and Congressman Berman and others have, a referendum that even a month or two ago we doubted could come off this well. And it came off peacefully, and all the observer missions, whether the Arab League, the Africa Union, the UN, the NDI, or others, all saying this was a credible, fair, effective referendum. It took a lot of work, a lot of diplomatic work, a lot of wonderful work by the United Nations, and USAID assembled an extraordinary team of IFAS, NDI, IRA, the Carter Center, all working together to give the Southern Sudan Referendum Commission the technical support it needed against all the odds to be ready on January 9th to pull this off. So there was a lot involved here, and a lot of people deserve credit. But as you said in your opening statement, this is just one step. There's a lot of hard work left to go. One of the issues, and Congressman Payne emphasized this and others have as well, is ABA. ABA is a deeply difficult, emotional issue in Sudanese politics and in its history. Even during the referendum, we had instances of violence in that area that was finally brought under control with the help of the UN and the meeting of the parties. And there was an agreement signed this past weekend that should permit the beginning of the migration, security for it, and other arrangements should contain the situation. But the underlying issue of the future of ABA remains a very critical one. It's an issue that probably can only be solved at the level of the presidents, of President Bashir and President Kiir, and we hope that action will resume on those negotiations very shortly after the referendum. There are other processes. There are the popular consultations that are very important in Blue Nile and South Kordofan. I'm happy to say that the consultations have started in Blue Nile. I will be visiting that area next week to witness some of those consultations, and we hope South Kordofan will be able to start soon after the elections in that state. And as you've all said, there are a whole range of issues that the two parties now have to get down to work and solve by July. The relationships between what looks like now two independent countries, but who share so much interdependence. As you know, much of the oil's in the south, much of the infrastructure for exporting it and refining it is in the north. People live along that border, some 30% of the population, and they go back and forth all the time. There needs to be a solution to the oil sector, to citizenship issues, to what both parties have called soft borders and how they'll operate, security arrangements, currency, etc. A lot of work's been done, a lot of technical work has been done, but now the political work has to start on bringing these issues to a head. Now, you've mentioned the question of our relationships to Sudan, and particularly to the government of Northern Sudan, and it's a very important issue. Part of the discussions that have been going on for the last month is how the U.S. relationship with Northern Sudan played into the negotiations. And there was a very strong feeling that until there was some sense of our own relationships with the Sudan and the future of Sudan, there would be an obstacle there to the negotiations themselves. But something equally important that I've discovered in my time there, I've met with leaders of the opposition in the north, I've met with women's groups and youth groups, and what I find is that the people of Northern Sudan are terribly worried about the outcome of the CPA. They feel that they're going to be abandoned. They feel that it will lead to war. They feel that it will lead to economic deprivation. And they want to know what the future is for them once the South is gone. And that's an important concern, because instability in the North, or chaos in the North, is not going to be any more in our interest than to chaos in the South. There also has to be political transformation in the North. That's part of the dream, if you will, the objective of the CPA, and it hasn't really happened. So we want to be engaged in the North. We want it to be successful and strategically stable, and we want to see prosperity for the people there. We have put out a roadmap for normalization with Northern Sudan after the CPA. And I can assure you that it is based on actions. It's not based on promises. The first step only comes after the government accepts the results of the referendum. And the step there, as the President said in his letter to Senator Kerry, which Senator Kerry presented to the Sudanese, was that the President would begin the process of withdrawing Sudan from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. But they would have to meet all the conditions under that law, and they would also have to complete the negotiations, which you've all well described, for the remaining balance of the CPA. And there has to be progress toward peace in Darfur. So before we can even complete that process, and certainly before we would come to Congress and discuss the possible lifting of sanctions, steps would have to be taken, concrete steps by the North. In the meanwhile, a great deal has to be done on helping southern Sudan. It is an area, as all of you know, devastated by war, extraordinarily poor, with almost no infrastructure to speak of. You fly over southern Sudan, you see very little agricultural activity, you see almost no roads. You have very low educational base and a thin administrative structure. A lot of donors are working on that problem. We are the major donor. Our technical assistance this past year to the government of Southern Sudan is about $430 million. Other donors are contributing just under $700 million to developing the capacity of the South. A lot of countries are involved. Kenya is the biggest trainer of technical personnel. The UK, the European Union, Norway, and others, and China has begun a development program in the South. But it's going to be a long, hard struggle for the South to meet the expectations of its people. We've done a lot and will continue to do a lot to build up their capacity, their ability for conflict resolution within the South, their ability to deliver in education, health, and the other areas of which their people expect. Now, Darfur is not my brief. General Gratian, and he apologizes for not being able to be with you today. He was just in Darfur this past week, and he's joined now by another colleague of mine, Dane Smith, who will be working on Darfur in the same way that I've been working on the North-South. But I don't want anybody to get the impression that the administration is either forgetting Darfur or sacrificing Darfur to the CPA. In fact, there's a good deal of interaction in Sudan between the two. There has to be peace in both places for Sudan, North and South, to succeed. I'm not the expert on Darfur, but I know that work is underway to try and bring peace, to strengthen UNAMID, to increase access for the humanitarian organizations, and above all, to get a credible peace process. And I'm sure General Gratian would be happy to brief you on all of that. Let me just conclude on one issue raised by Congressman Smith, a very important one about which we were very concerned, and that is the condition and the future for the Southerners living in northern Sudan. There's quite a few, as you know, estimates of as many as 1.5 million. Since the beginning of the CPA in 2005, 330,000 people have returned to South Sudan. Just since last August, 150,000 have returned, and more are returning all the time. What we found was that the process was erratic, not very well planned, and the states in the southern part of Sudan not prepared to receive them or get them to places where they could earn a livelihood. So we've worked now, and we in the UN, to try and regularize that process. We went to the government of Sudan and we said, we need access to all the places where the Southerners live in the north. We didn't have that access before. We have it now. We and the UN and international agencies can now go visit the southern population in the north, find out what they're planning. UNHCR is going to begin a registration process and try and make more orderly the process of departure. Second, we're working with the government in the South to come up with more realistic timetables and plans for absorbing that many people in what is a very poor area. So I just wanted to assure you that this is an issue high on our list, and we have been given assurances, but we'll monitor it very closely, that there'll be no reprisals against those people. But it does raise one final issue that you've all mentioned, and that's the citizenship issue. Because the question is, what happens when the South becomes independent to Southerners living in the North or Northerners living in the South? The government of Sudan, the northern government, the NCP, has said that they will not support dual citizenship for everyone. And that's a right of a government to say that. But what we and others have argued is, and both sides have agreed in principle, that you cannot create a situation of statelessness for anyone. Therefore, there has to be a period of transition during which Southern Sudan develops its own rules, regulations, and procedures for citizenship, and then Southerners who so wish can access that citizenship if they choose. These are very important issues, both for the stability of the country and in terms of basic human rights. And it's one of the critical issues still to be negotiated. I'll stop there, Madam Chairman. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you so very much. Excellent testimony. And we will begin our question and answers now. But I just want to remind our members, pursuant to longstanding committee practice, I will be recognizing you by seniority for those who were here when I make the sound of the gavel, and then by order of arrival for those who arrive after the gavel. So there's an incentive to get here on time, boys and girls. And I'm pleased as punch to have so many members of our freshman class on our committee, and to make a public declaration of how pleased I am. I randomly chose among the wonderful freshman members of our committee Mr. Duncan's name, so I will yield my time, my question and answer time, to Mr. Duncan from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam
Mr.
Chairman.
Duncan is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Lyman, thank you for coming to address the committee today about Sudan, and just have a few questions because we're concerned about terrorism in the world. We're concerned about national security. And can the administration credibly certify to Congress that Sudan has permanently ceased support for fellow state sponsors of terrorism, including Iran and Syria, and designated foreign terrorist organizations, including Hamas?
Excuse me. First, Madam Chairman, I forgot, I submitted a fuller statement for the record, if that's okay. Congressman, that will be part...
Without objection, thank you.
Thank you very much. That will be part of this process that would begin, and it's a process whereby the relevant agencies in the United States government would be examining that. I think the requirement is to look at it over a 6-month period to make sure that Sudan would meet all the criteria under the law regarding counterterrorism. That process hasn't yet begun because the President hasn't announced it, because it's conditional even begin that process based on the acceptance of the results of the referendum. But I assure you that that will be done, and that the administration will then consult with Congress on the results of that review.
Just to follow up, what do you make of the independent or open source reports that Iranian arms transit Sudan en route to Hamas and the Gaza Strip? Can you help with that?
I can't comment on that, Congressman, but I can assure you that those are the kinds of issues that will be looked at in this review process.
Are open source reports of Bashir's strong relationship, Hamas leadership, inaccurate?
I'm afraid I'm not in a position to comment on that. I again say that the agencies in the U.S. government are going to examine all of that as part of this process. I apologize that I'm not in a position to comment on that information, which our agencies will have to determine and verify.
We'll look forward to the time that you can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that maiden voyage. Welcome to all of our wonderful freshmen. Thank you. And I'd like to yield 5 minutes to our wonderful ranking member, Mr. Berman.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'm going to follow your lead, and I'm going to yield my 5 minutes to the putative and I think soon to be ranking member of the Africa Subcommittee, the longtime chair of that subcommittee, and to a great extent, to one of my key mentors on the issue of Sudan, Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, of us, for yielding. And Pastor Lyman, the AU was very involved in this EGAD, which is, as most of us know, the East African Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which has several East African countries, about 6 or 7, Kenya, Uganda, et cetera. And they were very involved, as you know, in the negotiations at Navasha. How strong do you believe that the AU and IGAD will remain in Sudan as they move forward to the more difficult times?
I think the roles are going to be different. The Africa Union is now charged with overseeing the post-referendum negotiations over the issues we talked about. And the high-level panel that the AU has created to do this is headed by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, and then with former Burundian President Paul Biya and former Nigerian President Abu Bakr. And they have a staff and have overseen the structure of the negotiations. I'm happy to say that we in the UN work very, very closely with them. We are official observers in those discussions and work very closely with them on the negotiations. IGAD now plays, I think, a more political role. The IGAD summit some weeks ago was a very important step in confirming assurances from the government of Sudan about the referendum and proceeding with the CPA. They are not as active as they used to be in Naivasha elsewhere in the actual negotiations.
And how do you see as we know, ABA is certainly a very difficult issue to confront, but also, as you know, the Blue Nile and the southern Kordofan states have also some question about where they really belong. What is your take on those 2 states?
Well, the CPA did not see the popular consultations as the same as for ABA. ABA was accorded the right of self-determination to see whether they wanted to be part of the North or South. That is not included in the terms of reference for the popular consultations. What the popular consultations are supposed to do for those 2 states is to determine how the CPA has affected them and how their relationships both internally in the state and with Khartoum should take place. They're more like, if I can describe it, good governance consultations rather than self-determination consultations. And what we are pleased about with Blue Nile is a tremendous amount of interest taking place as those consultations get underway. People are coming forward, civil society is coming forward, and they will look very carefully at both the governance of the state and the way the central government impacts on their lives. As you know, elements in those states fought on the side of the SPLM, but they live in the north, and they're part of the north. So the question really that is being posed is, what kind of political structure will we be seeing in the north that accommodates their interests and the interests of everyone else in the north?
And the final question about Egypt and the Nile. Egypt can be very, very constructive, or they can be very destructive, and they have changed roles during this whole conflict. The Nile is something that Egypt feels concerned about. How do you think the negotiations regarding Egypt and the North and other countries will go on the Nile?
I think it's not a secret that Egypt was very concerned about the whole self-determination vote and the implications of it. But toward the latter part of the year, Egypt became very supportive. And just prior to the referendum, President Mubarak, along with President Gaddafi, came and urged the government to go ahead and go through with the referendum and follow the dictates of the CPA. And I think the attitude of Egypt is that they're going to work with the new government of Southern Sudan. Now, water, as the chairwoman has said, is one of the issues to be negotiated, how the water is managed, the Nile, which cuts through both Southern and Northern Sudan, are going to be managed, access to water, amounts of water. Those negotiations have not gotten very far, and they will be important, and clearly Egypt will be watching them very closely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chairman-designate of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee, Mr.
very much,
Smith of
Madam
New
Chair.
Jersey, is recognized.
Thank you. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your extraordinary service and your leadership. Let me ask a couple of questions. First, you mentioned the first step beginning the process of removing Sudan from the state-sponsored of terrorism list. Ambassador Williamson and I were serving with him at the UN Human Rights Commission when it was a commission in Geneva, and he led the effort on getting the focus on genocide being committed in Darfur. Did an outstanding job doing it. He makes a point in his testimony that we must make that determination purely on the merits, not tilted to some other political considerations. And based on what you said, it sounds like that's the process you're going to pursue, but I would just like to hear you say it in your own words or further elaboration. Secondly, churches play a key role, perhaps even a central role, in the provision of humanitarian and development aid and in promoting dialogue and mediating crises. Will the faith-based sector in the new Republic of Southern Sudan, if that's what emerges here, receive a significant amount of money to immediately have a high impact on healthcare delivery and the like? Thirdly, the ICC chief prosecutor said that Bashir may have skimmed upwards of $9 billion. Is that true? What do we know about that? And finally, I mentioned in my opening about the 35,000 Southerners who remain in the North in forced servitude. In the mid-1990s, I held a hearing on slavery in Sudan, was roundly criticized when I had it, and I can tell you by who if you ask, roundly criticized, but we brought out the point that, and I even had a mother who told the harrowing story of how they broke into her home, stole her son, kidnapped her son, gave him an Islamic name, and then he became part of a slavery regime. What are we doing about that?
Oh, thank you very much, Congressman. On the first question, with regard to the state sponsors of terrorism, first and foremost, they have to meet all the conditions under that law, so it has to be on the merits of that. But secondarily, we've also said that the final step has to be in the context of their also meeting the conditions of the CPA. So it's what the first and foremost is they have to meet those criteria. And then second, when we would take the step would be when they've also, if they meet all those criteria, that they would also have to meet the criteria under the CPA. On churches, I don't know the exact plans on USAID, but I will say this. They play an extraordinarily important role in Southern Sudan, as you know. And they have been very important in conflict resolution, and I think they'll play a major role in the development side. There's no question that's one of the elements of society. What I'll just take a second to say something that has bothered me about the peace process. It's not been terribly transparent. That is, it's been carried on, and we're part of this too, between two parties, but civil society hasn't been brought in very much. I think now, as we move forward, there must be much broader transparency and involvement of civil society in what comes next, and that very much includes the churches. On the $9 billion, I've seen the accusation. I haven't seen the proof, so I can't say. On slavery, it's a very, very bitter memory for people who suffered that. And that includes the people in the Abyei area. Clearly, the independence of Southern Sudan, if that's what the vote will show, may alleviate that problem and other security steps. But clearly, that has to go if it exists anymore. But the memory is there, and I know people who have spoken to me about the bitterness they feel about it.
Finally, let me ask one final question in my time. Are there sufficient resources available at the UNHCR as well as within our own government and other contributors to assist the Southerners in the North, to register them, as you said, to mitigate the incidents of retaliation? And what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of funds?
The Southern Sudan government talks about another 500,000 or up to 500,000 people coming. So that would be another 350,000. We have made it a very, very strong part of our diplomacy with the North that no retaliation or violence takes place against the Southerners in the North. We have been back to them on this over and over and over again, and so far they've respected that, and they claim they will respect it. But the future of those people in terms of citizenship and economics, et cetera, is still an important consideration. Now, UNHCR is just beginning, really, now that it has access to start to register people, et cetera. There is sufficient international stocks of emergency supplies to handle people when they come south, let's say, to get 3 months' supply of food, et cetera. The problem is how well these people can be integrated for long-term development, because some of them aren't farmers, they haven't been farmers, et cetera. And this is something we have under discussion now with the government of Southern Sudan, and how our development programs can help in that regard. That, to me, is becoming the most serious challenge. So far, we've been able to work in the north without any retaliation against those people.
Thank you so much. So please yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend, Congressman Sears.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and congratulations. Ambassador Lyman, as I listen to you, I sense a hope in your voice that this is going to succeed. But as I listen carefully to what you say to me, to the committee, I'm not as optimistic. I mean, there's no infrastructure, no health, no way of feeding. There's a referendum going at one end of the country. What steps can we take to continue to encourage the peace? And I worry when you split these countries, we don't have a good experience in Korea. Still, the tensions are still there. And I worry when all this money comes in to try to help. I look at Haiti and the lack of infrastructure. Sorry, but you sound optimistic, but I'm not as optimistic as you are. And I do hope that we can continue, there have so many years of war that I do hope that this leads to peaceful in the future. So can you just tell us what we can do?
You caught me on a good week. That's because a couple months ago I was much less optimistic, and I'm very encouraged that that this referendum has come off, and that what I think it signifies for the future. But I wouldn't underestimate the problems ahead. Look, there are several different peace problems. One is peace in the South itself, where there have been clashes in the past, proxy supported by the North, et cetera. Now, we are working hard to build up their security capability. By that I mean their ability to manage conflict, to manage local issues, communicate better, coordinate better, et cetera. Lots of countries along with us are training people, et cetera. President Kiir has promised a very inclusive political process in the future for a new constitution in the South. He must follow that path. Otherwise, there will be dissension and there will be trouble. I'm reasonably optimistic that they'll rise to the challenge, but I think it's going to be a good long struggle. The other danger is in the continuing tensions that will exist from time to time between the North and the South. One of the points we've emphasized so much to both sides in the last few months is don't support proxies. That is, that the North doesn't support proxies in the South, and vice versa, that the South doesn't support proxies in Darfur or someplace else. It's a very important part of keeping peace, and they've got to resolve their tensions in other ways. I think that the hope for peace in the area comes from their inevitable interdependence, whether it's in the oil sector, it's the trade sector, et cetera. Both sides need each other right now. And both sides now are not interested in going back to war. And if we can build on that, and they can build on that, it's not going to be perfect. And there are going to be crises, and there are going to be threats. But I guess I'm more optimistic now than I was a few months ago.
And the other issue that I have concern is you talked about the oil. Obviously, the oil is in the South. And the North is going to feel that they have been excluded of this wealth. How are they going to I just don't see them sitting back and saying, well, you had this referendum, you keep the oil, and I'll stop the water from going south.
Actually, their leverage is greater because all the pipelines to export the oil are in the North.
Okay.
So what they've had to do, and the Norwegians have been extremely helpful in this regard, in laying out all the complexities of how two countries with shared resources can work out a fair compensation. During the CPA, they split the oil revenues 50-50, but that was temporary. Now there's a question of whether the South will keep that ratio, whether they'll pay a fee for the use of the pipelines, et cetera. Those are the details they've got to work out now. But they kind of need each other on the oil. The other thing which is very important, again, we're grateful to the Norwegians for this analysis, that oil isn't that great. Over the next 5 years, it will decline substantially in output. Both sides have to develop an economy that is less dependent on oil. And that's an important reason for them to turn their attention away from war.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chairman-designate of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Mr. Rohrabacher, California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Ambassador, what's the population of Sudan, both north and south?
Oh, I'm afraid you were going to ask me that.
Somebody must.
There's about 8 million in the south, and what is it in the north? 38 million overall, thanks to Rich. 38 million overall, about less than a third in the south.
I'll tell you, when I worked in the White House, he had all the answers as well. I
Yeah.
just want you to know that. So 38 million altogether. And how much have we spent in Sudan?
Since the CPA, overall, for all expenditures, peacekeeping and everything else, we've spent $10 billion.
How much?
$10 billion.
We spent $10 billion.
Much of that for peacekeeping and relief because of the wars and the displacement, et cetera. But yes, that's the
right.
figure over.
Now, is that just us, or is that the overall spending? We spent $10 billion, or
No, we, the
we.
U.S.
So, and how much has been spent then? We spent $10 billion. How much have the other philanthropists of the world spent?
They've contributed, of course, to peacekeeping. They contribute toward a formula in the UN, the
Right.
formula that they always contribute to. On the economic side, I know, for example, that other donors have been doing about $700 million a year in the South. I don't have the figures for what they're doing in Darfur. I can try and get those for you.
That would be, but your guesstimate would be that we are the biggest contributor, and almost 50% maybe of what's been spent.
We are
has
clearly
been
the
us.
largest donor, and I'll try and get you more accurate percentages.
Okay. Now, what a fortuitous day for you to be testifying, because President Hu from China has just arrived. And I was wondering how much the Chinese have actually contributed to this effort.
Well, the Chinese, of course, as members of the Security Council, pay whatever their share is of peacekeeping costs as permanent members of the Security Council. They also have begun a development program in the South. They also contribute a fair number of peacekeepers to the UN peacekeeping force. We don't contribute
Right.
soldiers. They do. They have some engineering companies, et cetera, in the peacekeeping operation. They are, of course, as you know, big investors in the oil industry in Sudan.
Right. And but you don't know what they've spent. And I think that's significant, because it's my understanding that the Chinese perhaps are benefiting greatly by their association with the government in the north, and et cetera.
There's no question that oil has been a successful investment for them, but now that the oil lies largely in the South, they understand that they have to develop relationships in the South as well, and they are beginning development programs, road programs, health programs, et cetera, in the South.
Let me just note that, now, first of all, have you believed that the Chinese have played a positive role in Sudan? Is that what you would tell us today, that by and large the Chinese have played a positive role there over the years?
I think they're playing a more positive role now than they played before, to be perfectly candid. I think they were very resistant, as you well know, in the UN to sanctions on Sudan. And so there's a history there.
And they were opposed
they
to the
don't
sanctions.
participate.
Excuse me one moment, but they're opposed to those sanctions because they had a direct relationship with the tough guys who are running the country. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
and the guys who signed contracts for who gets the benefit from the oil.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Now, more recently, and they do most of their diplomacy behind the scenes. They don't work in concert with the rest of us envoys, who meet all the time. They have done some facilitation on the peacekeeping side. They contributed peacekeepers, and they have been supportive now of the referendum process. They've been openly supportive of that, and as I said, starting to do more in the South.
I've only got about 30 seconds left, and let me just note that we are entering a new era in government. We can no longer afford to have $1.5 trillion deficit. We figured that will destroy our country. And especially if we're going to be investing $10 billion in a country with 38 million people, $10 billion for 38 million people, and then see that another country, perhaps our economic adversary, like China, is benefiting greatly from our investment. We will have to, those are the things we need to pay attention to, and we will be. Thank you, Madam
Thank you
Chair.
so much. And because the ranking member had given his time to Mr. Payne, now Mr. Payne is recognized as the ranking member designate of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee for his question.
Thank you very much. I'm doing better under this new setup than I did under my own.
Well, let's discuss that later.
Let me continue, I think, on the China discussion. As you indicated, China was very non-involved, as you know, and there were several meetings that was held with the Chinese. The Congressional Black Caucus actually met with the ambassador and kind of had a pretty tough meeting with them, and they asked for a second meeting. They had never been to Darfur. They were still selling weapons. They just had no interest in this, in the problems of Sudan. I had the opportunity to go to Beijing, and the second in command of the government of China, we asked a question. I asked the question in the Great Hall once again about what were they going to do. Since then, as you've mentioned, they've sent people to Darfur. They've started participating in UN peacekeeping. How do you think China will react, and do you think they will be a true neutral party as this process moves forward?
I think the Chinese will have I don't want to speak for them really, but they have a stake in the oil sector. They have a stake that those are Chinese companies that own a good deal of the infrastructure as well as their share in the oil industry. They're very concerned about that. They want to make sure that whatever is worked out between the two entities on oil protects those interests. And of course, they import oil from Sudan, so they want the stability of the supply. I'm pleased that they've begun development programs in the South. I think that's very important. I think we need every donor we can to help in the South. How they will progress in their relationship between the two, it's a little hard for me to predict. Obviously, they will want to have relations in both countries to pursue their interests.
Now, in the South has the potential of a great agricultural program if they get going. At one time, Sudan was the breadbasket of all of Africa. And with the oil, are we looking at helping them develop that agricultural sector as we move forward? And secondly, what does Khartoum have left? What will their major resources be? Are they industrializing and manufacturing?
There was a conference in Nairobi some months ago in which the U.S. was a major participant. General Gratian was there and others, just on agricultural development in the South. It will have to be a major focus of their development efforts. They have this potential, but it's just not being realized at all. So that has to be a major part of their economic development, no question about it. You go to Juba now, and all the fruits and vegetables are coming from Uganda. You know that the potential isn't being realized. In the North, they too have to develop the agriculture sector. They import a lot of food, which they shouldn't. and they are now turning more attention and investment to the food sector, knowing their oil revenues are going to go down, that they have extraordinary economic potential. They're getting investments from Arab countries in the agriculture sector, and I think that's going to be one of the major areas they look to as well.
Thank you. There's a lot of new technology on getting water out of the desert now, and that should be. I have agreed to yield the balance of my time back to the ranking member who I think has a question he'd like to ask. Mr.
Ranking
Berman.
member is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Payne, and you, Madam Chairman. And I just wanted to thank you, Ambassador. I was sitting here thinking, I came to Congress 28 years ago. You were a key figure in the Africa Bureau at that time during some incredible times, the fight against apartheid, the other conflicts in Africa going on, the role you played there, and later on as ambassador to South Africa in the new South Africa, the leader of our refugee programs during some of the most. I'm sure Mr. Smith remembers those years in Southeast Asia and in Africa, former Soviet Union, the places you worked there, your role before that at AID, Assistant Secretary for IO, serving both Republican and Democratic presidents. You really do give the term diplomat a great name with your stellar service, that you would come out of the academic world, I don't know if that's retirement, but to take this on is a great tribute to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr.
You're
Chairman.
very kind, Congressman. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now I'm pleased to yield to the Chairman-designate of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Royce of California.
Ambassador Lyman, you do have a long association with struggling with these problems on the continent of Africa. And we have many NGOs who are here today as well. One of the things that comes with that experience of long being engaged with these types of regimes is it gives you an important historical check on your assumptions going forward. And in particular, in dealing with Khartoum, which has broken promise after promise, when dealing with somebody like Bashir, who is in power not because he's a peacemaker, he's in power because he is the most ruthless. When looking at that situation, and I've seen firsthand the result of that ruthlessness. In Sudan, in Darfur, Sudan, I remember we had a Nightline camera crew we took in to interview some of the survivors of an attack. And I remember a town, Tinne, that had been bombed from the air. That was not an attack by the Janjaweed. Those were Antonovs that bombed that town. I remember interviewing a young man who had lost his hand. He'd lost his hand with a Janjaweed, but with his other hand, he was able to draw pictures, as other kids did, of these Antonovs that had bombed their village, and of mechanized armor, which was from the Khartoum's government, there to support the Janjaweed in the attack. So in looking at this, the NGO community, I think, is very hesitant to reach assumptions that all is going to end well. And in one particular regard, there is an issue that all of us are concerned about, and it has to do with that issue of the state sponsor of terrorism list. Because Joseph Kony of the Lord's Resistance Army could not have abducted 10,000 children and abused so many over the last 20 years and made child soldiers out of them without the armaments he got from Khartoum, and without being able to send his fighters up to Khartoum to be patched up, without the support that he had. They didn't allow people to go into South Sudan to take him out when we had the opportunity to do it. So the question I have is, have you made it very clear to Khartoum that any support for the LRA would prevent them from being taken off the terrorism list, and basically that for you, this is a red line? That's my question.
I can say categorically we have said that any support of them by proxies or other such entities would preclude our following through on that.
Very good.
And in general, I would say in dealing with the regime, the way forward is for them to understand that this is the way for them to go forward, because it's worse for them if they don't, in terms of peace, in terms of any thoughts of prosperity.
And that's logical. But then we have the historical record, and we have the fact that for 10 years, between 94 and 05, Sudan is the only documented supporter for the LRA. And we have a UN report in November, last November, that LRA commanders reached out to Sudan's military in Darfur for support. Now, we don't know much more than that, other than that happened. But I guess my last question is, would the State Department certify to Congress that there are no links between the government in Khartoum and the LRA before taking them off the terrorism list? I guess that's a little harder question.
It is a harder question. I'll get you a definitive answer, because I have talked to the people who do that kind of analysis. But I can tell you this: I have discussed personally, and I know General Gratian has, the LRA with the government, and made it very clear that any support to the LRA would be an obstacle to normalization of relations with us. That's a terrible group. That's a horrific group.
Yeah, it's the most horrific group that probably on the planet.
Right.
And the fact that the Khartoum government would support. Ambassador Lyman, thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. The gentleman from Florida, my good friend, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Ambassador, in our administration's enthusiasm to engage local authorities and roll out basic materials and services as a conflict mitigation strategy, have appropriate safeguards to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse been implemented?
One of the things we're working on most intensely with the government of the South, which is where most of our development assistance is going, is exactly that. That is to get good financial controls, good budget controls, et cetera, so that we don't put money through the government without those kind of assurances. So we're watching that very closely. This is a young government in the South, and getting better controls, better financial controls is one of the top priorities. We're also doing that at the state level, because resources have to be sent down to the state level. So we're working with the state governments in the South to make sure they have those controls in place, and we will continue to do that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. A couple other questions. What is the status of the SCRS flyaway teams that have been deployed to South Sudan, and what are they doing exactly?
Those teams are out visiting and staying in areas throughout the South to be able to get an understanding of whether there are conflicts developing in the South, whether the state governments are capable of dealing with them, so that proper assistance and responses can be made. It's kind of an extended outreach for the United States to know what's happening out there, to make sure that the potentials for conflict in the South, which are serious, are being addressed, that we know what's happening, that we have good information, and they've been effective over these last couple of months.
Well, if we could drill down on that just a little bit further. What types of program funds are they administering? To what end? Are they implementing directly? Are they employing contractors or providing budget support to local institutions?
They're only providing information. It's up to USAID and other programs to then help with those states and help in their security. The flyaway teams are information gathering teams.
A few governance questions. Is the administration planning to certify that an elected government has taken office to justify removing restrictions on U.S. assistance to Sudan under Section 7008 of the State Foreign Operations and Related Programs Appropriations Act of 2010, as carried forward.
Assuming that they voted for secession, they will not become fully independent under the CPA until July. And then, of course, we would have to have a legislation with the Congress that would authorize assistance to that entity. We don't have to do it right away because independence becomes official at the end of the CPA.
Will the Secretary of the Treasury also be moving to make such a certification to provide debt relief to the regime?
Debt relief is, there are sanctions against our supporting debt relief. And it depends on how the debt is divided, also between the North and the South. If some of the debt is assumed by the South and they become an independent entity, and I would want to consult with the Congress closely on this, we could support the South in doing that. But any general debt relief, assuming that the North carries much of that debt, there are sanctions, and they would have to be removed for us to support action on debt relief for the North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. And now I'd like to yield for our last, no, we still have one more. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, who is the chairman designate of the Subcommittee on Middle East and South Asia. And thanks for subbing for me this weekend, Mr. Shabbat.
Happy to do it, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate the opportunity to do that. And you are loved down there. There's no question about that. So we appreciate it filling in for you. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your time here this afternoon. And I know you've answered a lot of questions. There's just a couple that I have. Relative to the referendum and assuming that it goes the way that virtually everyone believes that it will, and that the vote in the South is to essentially secede, could you, and I know you've already talked about this to some degree, but could you discuss again what mechanisms are expected to take place relative to the oil revenues and wealth sharing and that sort of thing in the disputed areas?
The two entities face some choices on how to handle the management of the oil sector. One is to create a joint management of the sector. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's one option out there. Another is to have the South take an equity position in the infrastructure in the North, so they're part owner as well, and the economics works out that way. A third option is simply for the South to pay a fee for transporting the oil through the pipelines. And there are a number of variations on this, all of which I owe what limited knowledge I have of this to the Norwegians, who have laid this out in great detail for the two parties. So they will choose among these potential ways of cooperating. And then the political decision is, how much do the South pay to the North? Is there a premium for peace, to put it bluntly, in what they pay? And that's going to be the political side of the negotiation. On the other issues, there are working groups on all the other issues looking at them technically. For example, on currency. If both countries move to a new currency, how do they do it very carefully not to destabilize the other? Because you could do that. And they've agreed in principle that they won't destabilize each other. But then the question is, what's the timing? How do they do it in the proper way? So there's a working group on that. And similarly on borders, there's a working group, although, again, the decisions there are very political, because there are 5 disputed border areas. Most of the border is agreed, but 5 areas disputed, and they haven't agreed on how to solve the dispute. And that's now a major issue to be resolved.
Thank you. And then another area, Mr. Ambassador, when I was here for 14 years and then gone the last 2, and so I've gotten a little behind in some of these things over the last 2 years, but I've been to the Darfur region 2 different trips, one on the refugee camps in Sudan, and then the other time the refugee camps in Chad. And at the time, things seemed to be simmering down somewhat, to the extent that the Janjaweed attacks had been shall we say, limited compared to the way they had been previously, and although many people were still in the camps. Has there been any progress in the people moving out of the camps and back to their villages, or is it too dangerous in most places for that to occur?
Again, I have to apologize because Darfur isn't in my brief. I don't have the update details. I don't think there's been a lot of movement in that regard. There was some violence very recently between the South African Sudan armed forces and one of the rebel groups that displaced a lot of people additionally. But I would defer to General Gratian when he's here and my colleague Dane Smith to give you a more accurate up-to-date. I apologize that Darfur I'm not as sharp on.
That's quite all right, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for your time. I yield back the balance of my time, Madam
So
Chair.
much, Mr. Shabbat. And the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, which is a much revered name in Miami, yields his time. And we thank you so much because we're so short of time. So we're going to say thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your time. Get back to work. We're going to shoo you out of there. And I'm going to welcome Ambassador Richard Williamson and Omar Ishmael to our panelist table. And I'm going to give you the briefest of introduction. And gentlemen, I am going to be ruthless with my gavel because we want to get to the question and answer period. So as you settle in, let me introduce you. Ambassador Williamson has served as the President's Special Envoy for Sudan and as the U.S. representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, where he pressed for the adoption of a resolution condemning the atrocities in Darfur in conjunction with the United Nations commemorations of the 10th anniversary of genocide in Rwanda. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador, and I know that your book is here floating about. And Omar Ishmael, thank you so much, Omar. You are so loved, a humanitarian, human rights activist, working with numerous organizations to stop genocide and mass atrocities. Mr. Ishmael was born in Darfur, but was forced to flee Sudan in 1989. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here, and I will gavel you down in 5 minutes so we can get to our question and answers because we have votes on the floor in a little bit. Thank you. Ambassador Williamson, if you could start.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and congratulations on that. Good to see Ranking Member Berman again. And I have to note, Don Payne has spent more time working on Sudan than any other American leader, and we're all in his debt. And as Congressman Smith said, we've worked together in the past. It's good to be with you again. I think in Sudan you have to first start with the fact that there's been marginalization for 200 years. That's resulted in discrimination economically, educationally, health, politically, injustice. And that permeates the country, and that creates instability. And the South is only a small part of the story. Second, we have to recognize that unfortunately in Sudan, it's too common that the political leaders feel comfortable resorting to violence as a legitimate way to pursue their political objectives and engage in atrocities. And thirdly, we have to recognize the nature of the regime. The vote is a shining moment. The Sudan people deserve most of the credit. The international community, U.S. brokered the CPA, President Bush, and while I've criticized President Obama and his administration, they deserve credit for their initiative the last 4 months, the diplomatic surge, which was extremely helpful. But the vote is not the end of the story. It may not even be the beginning of the end of the story. The contested border areas, ABA, oil revenue sharing, and citizenship are not just the headlines of issues. It is the fundamental dispute which over 6 years have been known. For 6 years, Khartoum has blocked progress on those issues. And for the last 6 months, 4 months, notwithstanding the initiative, little substantive particularized progress has been made. Fourth, my experience is that the CPA, the regime in Khartoum, breaches commitments. Look at just the CPA. They agreed to abide by the ABA Border Commission. It made its determination. The South accepted it. The North refused. They agreed to abide by the arbitration, the Permanent Arbitration Court in The Hague, in its determination of the border. That process went forward. The South accepted it. The North refused. In the CPA, the North agreed to disarm and demobilize their militias. They did not. They committed to transparency and oil revenue sharing and accounting. They did not. It is important to recognize that incentives alone are inadequate, promises are illusory, and incentives without steel, without some threat of coercion, have proven a failure in the past, and they will let down the Sudanese people again. Underlying all this, what is the U.S. goal in 2005? It was in part the separation, and we paid for that. It would be overpaying now to say that because haltingly, imperfectly, in a delayed manner, and having cost many lives, that we should now be overly generous for the performance of commitments made. The marginalization continues, the injustices continued, atrocities continued. The week before the vote began in the referendum, 18 bombs dropped in the South. The UN certified that they were from the Sudan Armed Forces. And the South is not the only area subjected to this. Darfur and the Nuba Mountains cannot be separated. We should not rush to give benefits. The 9 neighbors in China have not been helpful, but we've reached a tipping point where they see that separation is going to happen, so they have been on the margins helpful. They can do more. The administration has tried to encourage it. They should. There's an enormous development challenge, but it has to have burden sharing, and the European Union and others have to increase their participation. I am concerned about a process that begins in a litany of incentives before performance, before specific agreements, before verification mechanisms are put in place, before there's monitored results. As Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. I am concerned about it, and I fear once again the Sudanese people will be denied what they need. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Much. Thank you, Mr. Ishmael.
Congratulations and thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to the esteemed members of your committee. I will get down to it. The United States has a crucial role to play in laying the groundwork for peace and stability in Sudan from this moment forward. The Southerners have come out, they cast their vote. They are going to decide their destiny, which is going to be the separation from the mother country of Sudan. But as everybody agrees, including President Obama on his op-ed, the New York Times, that the work is just beginning. So the United States should capitalize on this current momentum in Sudan to address 3 crucial issues that will establish peace and stability in all of Sudan and the neighboring countries in the region. First, the relationship between North and South Sudan must be clarified before secession formally takes place in July. This involves detailing the economic arrangements between North and South after separation, the legal status of populations in both the North and the South, as well as resolving the status of contentious border areas. Without agreement on these issues, anxieties on the ground and among the leadership of both governments have the potential to spark violence. Second, the conflict in Darfur must be reprioritized. An inadequate peace process has trickled along for years while violence has intensified in recent weeks. Now is the time to revitalize the Darfur peace process, one that has inched along for years with very limited effect on the ground in Darfur. Number 3, at a time when political changes will be underfoot in both the North and the South, the U.S. should press both governments towards inclusive governance and pluralism to ensure that peace endures in Sudan, both in North and the South. Sharing oil revenues, the currency, citizenship, border, and the issue of ABA are very crucial. But until now, the international community has been content to let the Sudanese parties delay making the difficult and necessary decisions to ensure peaceful transition. In place of this unassertive mediation, the U.S. should jumpstart a far more proactive international mediation, modeled upon the Nevada peace process that produced the CPA. The Sudanese government in August unveiled its own Darfur strategy that would nationalize or domesticate the political process and focus on the return of IDPs, development and implementation of justice locally. We believe that this plan is not only problematic, but that it hides the government's true intention of seeking a military solution in Darfur. We believe the way forward is for the U.S. to help a decisive roadmap to secure peace in Darfur based on a sound diagnosis of why efforts to date have fallen short of the mark. This will require robust engagement with the mediation team, significant diplomatic and technical support, and securing constructive participation by the Europeans, China, and the regional actors. Finally, the U.S. should capitalize on the opportunity for political reform that South Sudan secession presents for both the North and the South. In the North, several of the processes that the United States should strongly support are specifically mandated under the CPA, including a constitutional review that involves public participation, as well as popular consultation in the border states of Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, investing in civil society groups, independent voices, political party development, and other building blocks to a more democratic future are fundamental steps that the U.S. can take toward preventing future conflict in Sudan. In the South, we see a fragile new state that is filled with potential. It is in the interest of the United States to help lay the foundation for good governance and invest in real institution and capacity building, the development of a strong parliament and judiciary, as well as executive institutions that deliver services, share power, and transparently administer tax and oil revenue will be key to the peace in Southern Sudan. As the United States moves towards forward to urgently ensure that the two Sudans separate amicably but find the common ground necessary to sustain peace in the tumultuous corner of the world, we must do what we can to help deliver on the promises to all Sudanese. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, gentlemen. You have proven that you can be brilliant and succinct. Thank you. And I will yield my time to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ambassador Williamson, thank you very much for being here. By the way, what years were you at the United Nations Human Rights Commission?
Oh, it was 04, I think it was.
I was there in the late 80s and early 90s working for one of your predecessors, U.S. Ambassador Armando Valladares.
I was Assistant Secretary Frio at the time, and Armando was working for me. He did a great job, pushed an important issue, and we should continue to put pressure on the island prison.
Thank you, and thank you for those words. Thank you for your service. With respect to the roadmap, Ambassador, pursuant to the roadmap presented, the administration is poised to remove Sudan from the state sponsors of terrorism list, facilitate high-level visits, exchange ambassadors, ease sanctions, and advance negotiations for debt relief in exchange for Khartoum meeting its own obligations under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. United States leverage with regard to Darfur would be reserved to lifting sanctions that cannot be removed without legislative relief. In your opinion, does Khartoum care about the remaining sanctions, and realistically, what leverage would the United States have with regard to Darfur if the administration pursues this course?
First, a generic observation, Congressman. The less a regime deserves the mantle of legitimacy, the more they desire it. And those actions all raise into question the legitimacy of the government of Khartoum. So it's beyond whatever economic benefit or other benefits. It goes to their legitimacy within Sudan and outside. Second, as I noted earlier, I am concerned about being too anxious to provide incentives. Remember, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was agreed to 6 years ago. When I was Special Envoy, it was my view, after meeting with the leaders, often in Khartoum, meetings that drew the criticism from Senators Obama, Biden, and Clinton, that they had already made a decision at the time they signed CPA that they may be having to give up the South. I've noted that all the difficult issues that matter have not been resolved. We have a long way to go beyond the 6-month period when separation will become official before we know if those commitments will be made. And I also know from my various positions in government there's a bureaucratic momentum once you start the process. Again, to cite President Reagan, trust but verify. We have to see more.
Thank you, Ambassador. In November 2008, Ambassador Lyman participated in a conference hosted by the Embassy and Sweden and the United Nations Association on the responsibility to protect. And according to a meeting summary, he suggested that Darfur would be excluded from obligations inferred from the responsibility to protect because the crimes were committed prior to adoption of the World Summit Outcome document in 2005. What is your position on this, and does the United Nations have a responsibility to protect marginalized populations in Sudan in the event that the regime in Khartoum decides to crush all remaining opposition following a vote for independence in southern Sudan?
I think the general responsibility to protect preceded the Millennium Summit Outcomes document adopted in September 2005. Furthermore, I think when you look at the genocide in slow motion that continued after the adoption of that document, it is important for the United States and the international community to step up to its responsibility. Let me note, I'm loath to ever disagree with Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who I have the greatest respect for. But in this case, I do think we have a responsibility. I've noted that as recently as 2 weeks ago, Khartoum was involved in bombings in the south. They've been involved in bombings in Darfur. They continue to engage in coordinated attacks. It is less intense only because there are fewer targets of opportunity. This should be a concern. It's not delinked from the north-south, nor the difficulties in the Nuba Mountains. We have to be more robust, and one of the disappointments has been that those violations of past agreements have occurred, innocent lives have died, and there's been a reluctance in the administration to hold to account and publicly criticize the perpetuators of these atrocities.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your service again. Nice seeing you after 20 years, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much. So pleased to yield to the ranking member of Designate of Africa, Global Health and Human Rights, Mr. Payne of New Jersey.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you, Mr. Ismail, what do you think the prospects of a right to return for the people of Darfur? Has the government thought of any plan? Is it safe for some areas to have a right to return? For people to live in refugee camps for now until the next generation is wrong. So I would even like to see sanctions held until the government comes up with a plan of the right of people to return to their properties.
I couldn't agree more, Mr. Payne, because the government of Sudan had put every obstacle in the way of peace in Darfur, and the refugees and the IDPs cannot return today to their regions, to the place of origin, because A, there is nothing there after they've been burned, and all the infrastructure that was there to support life was destroyed during the attacks. And again, there is another reason, because most of these areas were occupied by people who, in some reports, we've seen that they don't even belong to Sudan, let alone belonging to Darfur and being citizens of Darfur. Number three, the violence still continues, and until today, counter to the SOFA agreement, the agreement of the deployment of the UN troops, the government of Sudan is still putting the obstacles in front of UNAMID and the UN troops that are supposed to protect these people and supposed to provide safe havens for those people who are willing to return, voluntarily to return to their areas. Yes, the sanctions should remain until that issue is addressed in Darfur.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Williamson, I remember meeting you in Abyei. The flames were still smoldering. What is your take on the East? We hear very little about the East, and as we know, there are problems there. How do you see the government in Khartoum moving forward with the problem in the East, with the separation from the South? Will there be panicking? Will the East decide that they should have some protest against the government and do something perhaps that happened in Darfur when that began? What do you think about that part?
Thank you, Congressman Payne. I think relevant to that is what has been the U.S. policy goal, a bipartisan policy goal in Sudan, and it's to bring sustainable peace, stability, and justice. Justice that's been denied due to marginalization. And you are correct, in the East, in the Nuba Mountains, as well as Darfur, as well as in the South, they have been victims of those injustices. And if there's dismemberment of Sudan and the South is independent next July, you still have the root cause of injustices that will not be addressed. And I am loath to be too generous until those issues are dealt with for those who've been subjected to violence as well as the injustice. And I think the instability and traumas will continue both in the East as well as in the West. Secondly, Congressman, there's a lot of talk about the stress that's going to be on the North after separation if it comes. And I acknowledge that that's true. There'll be people that say the government's lost its legitimacy. The opposition will try to unite. The rebel movements may move more aggressively in Darfur or overreach, but there also will be stress in the South. Political competition has been suppressed because of a unity to try to move to CPA implementation. And I would suggest to you that the competition that will be unleashed in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, also will be severe in Juba, that it'll be difficult for the government of Southern Sudan to be excessive in its concessions, especially those that aren't meritorious, and that the negotiators have to be mindful of that as well. Thank you.
Second, I have Louis Ocampos, who said that Bashir should still be indicted. Where do you think that's going?
I am very concerned. It's ironic that President George Bush, who opposed the ICC, was a stronger supporter for international accountability of the regime in Khartoum than this administration has been.
Thank you very much. The Chairman-designate Smith of the Africa Global Health and Human Rights Subcommittee.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your testimony and for your leadership. New York Times reporter Jeffrey Gentleman wrote a piece, Roots of Bitterness in a Region Threaten Sudan's Future, is in the New York Times on January 15th. And he talks about how most people in Abyei are armed to the teeth. My question first is, where have all those AK-47s gone that we believe the Chinese government helped to facilitate? Well in excess of 100,000. Are they there? Are we perhaps being a little bit too optimistic about the prospects of a peaceful transition here, or what?
I think, Congressman, if you're dealing with Sudan, you have to have a fault of optimism to be able to deal with such a difficult issue. So I have no fault there. But as you know, if it's human rights first, if it's the Small Arms Commission of the UN, the documentation of Chinese small arms has been irrefutable, and we can assume there have been credible reports of the flow of those arms down into regions near the border directed by Khartoum. It's a matter of great concern. I think, as Congressman Payne said, we were together in Abyei when the smoke was still coming up, where the charred bed remains, where there are no homes as far as you can see, and then in Aguk, where 50,000 people were living under torn sheets during the rainy season when you couldn't walk without mud up to your ankles. The tragedy of Abyei goes on. It goes on because of the oil. The vote was good, but the tough issues lie ahead.
If I may add, there is information that is coming from ABA that these weapons are there and the violence kind of spark at any moment. You might have heard of the Sentinel project that the Enough project with Harvard University and others have launched, and these are the eyes in the sky that are going to show us what is happening in ABA, so stay tuned. And also the Small Arms Survey and other open sources that are saying 55,000 of the 105,000 standing army of Sudan are in or around the area of ABA. If that is not a spark, that is going to start something. I don't know what it is. So we have to be vigilant. We have to work hard to avoid that clash from happening.
Thank you. Let me ask about the Sudanese slaves. I mentioned it earlier about the 35,000. Do you have any recommendations on how to liberate them from the bondage that they live in the north? Also on debt, $35 to $30 billion of indebtedness to mostly to other countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, but also, if my understanding is correct, about $2 billion to the U.S. When you talk about, or when the administration talks about the roadmap, could you again say whether or not you believe, because debt is certainly a part of that, lifting the designation as a state sponsor of terror and other issues obviously are in there as well. Could you speak to that roadmap, if you would, how comfortable you are with it, either of you? And finally, I'll run out of time. Why don't you go on those issues?
I will start with the roadmap in Darfur and as well in the south, because all these issues that we are talking about are real issues. The border and the ABA issue, and as far as the south is concerned, the debt and the currency and the citizenship. If you listen to the rhetoric coming out of Khartoum that the Southern Sudanese are going to be stripped of their citizenship the day after announcing the secession. And I don't know how they are going to define a Southern Sudanese from Northern Sudanese that are living in the north today. And how about dual citizenship? Something that the government gives to itself. Some ministers in the government of Sudan today, they hold other passports from different countries, including this country. And they are not going to allow the Southerners who are born and raised in Sudan as such to have dual citizenship. I don't understand that. We have to work hard in these issues. And the roadmap for Darfur, we have to revitalize the peace process. We have to support the mediation, and we have to have some high-level people who are involved in this, because the alternative of that is going to be violence in Darfur.
Thank you.
Quickly, Congressman, the most important thing with the slave tragedy is being very vigorous to push the rule of law, which doesn't exist. It's still the rule of position and power. And second, shining light on it. That's the best disinfectant to human rights abuses. The United States and others should both engage in speaking out more aggressively.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and let me first just say congratulations again. We're looking forward to working with you in this new Congress and with your leadership. And thank you for holding this timely and important hearing. I really wanted to focus my time and again acknowledge this referendum. I think it's cause for hope. The international community, especially the African Union, the UN, have played important roles in implementing the comprehensive peace agreement and were key facilitators of the referendum. I guess with all multilateral engagement, these efforts have been met with some criticism. But I'd like to ask our two panelists here why it's important for the U.S. to continue to engage in these international organizations to leverage the work in Sudan. What have been some of the tangible benefits so far, and how might we, going forward, maximize these collaborative efforts? And if we could start with Ambassador Williamson, please.
Thank you, Congressman. I think if we look at Sudan, we see a long history of various multilateral mechanisms making a contribution. The IGAD process itself, where it has 7 Eastern African countries, the Troika of the United States, Britain, and Norway, were instrumental in being the midwife of the comprehensive peace agreement. Since then, there's been significant multilateral efforts with respect to peacekeeping. First, the African Union forces, then the UN forces both in the South and in the West. They have not stopped violence. They can't. They don't have the capacity. The areas are too big, but they've crowded out the space for violence, and they've given some window for peace negotiations and discussions. I think you can also look at the assistance, where it's been an international effort through the Sudan Consortium. I think that Congressman Rohrabacher, and he'll probably raise it, about the burden sharing. The U.S. clearly has made a disproportionate contribution. Nonetheless, the Sudan Consortium has involved other countries, many other countries. Norway's taken the lead in coordination over the consortium, and there has been that assistance. But finally, sir, if I could, let me note that the success, to the degree there's been humanitarian success in Sudan, whether it's in Darfur or in the South, the unsung heroes are the humanitarian NGO organizations, their workers who are Sudanese as well as from countries all over the world, and the Sudanese nationals who also have participated in that, some risking their own lives. So it has been a collective effort. I do think the U.S. deserves note not only for its lead on the humanitarian assistance and its pivotal role in the political process, but this is a victory for the Sudanese people, but there have been many who've helped it along through international organizations and other mechanisms.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Ismail.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, and I think the United States stands to benefit a lot from the stability in Sudan. It's a huge country as it stands today, 1 million square miles, bordering 9 countries. If you just consider the western country of Chad, there, and it is a natural extension of Sudan in the Sahel, and put Nigeria into the equation, you will find that about 520 million people living in and around Sudan. If Sudan unravels, then this whole population is going to be thrown in a tailspin. We have seen the spillover of the LRA into Sudan and the spillover of Darfur into Chad and the destabilization that is created. This is very important. Besides the $10 billion that we just talked about here that the United States is spending in the South, they are today over $1 billion that the United States is spending in Darfur to keep about 3.5 million displaced alive. That is a huge burden if the Sudan was left to its own devices, and we have seen violence of the scales that we have seen before in Darfur and the South. Only God knows how much we are going to spend to keep some of these people alive in refugee camps, not in the safety of their homes.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carnahan. Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and Ambassador Williamson was right. I would like to focus a little bit on the disproportionate contribution that the United States is making, not only in Sudan, but this, I think, exemplifies many of the crises, humanitarian crises, that we find around the world. If there's anything the last election should have told the rest of the world, it is the United States can no longer afford to do this. We are going broke, and once our economy is broken by this irresponsibility that we've had, then we will be able to help no one, not our own people, not other people in crisis. The world needs to take that into consideration, notice it, and plan their futures proportionally. I would suggest that that is not to say that in Sudan and other places that we've seen these horrible tragedies take place, the heartrending murder of innocent people, we care about that, but we can no longer afford to carry as big a burden as we have. And what makes it worse, perhaps, and Ambassador Williamson, you seem a bit pessimistic that after this $10 billion of investment that we've made, that we will actually succeed. It's a rough road to go. Let me ask you, is the roadmap that has been set down, do you consider that to be adequate? Or, and if it is adequate, has it been enforced and followed? Or do we need, the roadmap will not succeed because it does not address the issues that need to be addressed?
Congressman Rohrabacher, if I can make a few points that I think are relevant. First, it's noteworthy that when the regime came to power in 1989, total exports were $500 million. They grew to $9.5 billion by 2008, almost all from oil, which is why the oil revenue sharing is crucial. Second, with that sort of money coming in, the government of Sudan, who designed the genocide in Darfur, as of the end of 2008, their total contribution to the humanitarian needs of the people in Darfur was $30 million. I think that's not irrelevant to the considerations of how much faith we should have. Secondly, China gets 6% of its imported oil. They have now, from Sudan, they have now tipped where they understand it's in their interest to have stability. They should step up more for humanitarian assistance. The larger question you raised on humanitarian assistance is beyond my purview. It's up to the 435 of you and the 100 across the way to make those decisions ultimately. But I do think there is an impulse in America that is worthy, that is part of our mission, that recognizes whether it's human rights, humanitarian assistance, we have an obligation to step up, but we should be tough-minded about it, get others to step up too, especially in these times of economic peril. And finally, let me just say on the roadmap, on good days I'm optimistic, but my experience teaches me to maybe be a little skeptical and cynical, and I think the talk of incentives without the talk of coercion, without the talk of steel, without the talk of being tough is a matter of great concern, as Bismarck said. Diplomacy without coercion is like sheets of music without instruments.
And no amount of humanitarian, assistance is going to increase the standard of living of anybody for any length of time unless it is accompanied by a democratization and a change in character of a regime that's capable of the type of violence that you have just described. Isn't that correct?
Yes, Congressman, I think it's important to note in the South, not only will they do they have 80% of this oil revenue show, but they have other mineral resources, and they have among the richest agricultural land anywhere outside of Illinois, where, of course, has the best architecture.
Let me note before my time runs out, which is one moment, and that is, Madam Chairman, if we are going to help people in the future and they have this potential wealth that exists, it is not wrong for us to suggest we are going to help you in this crisis, but we expect to be paid back one way or the other.
Thank you, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple questions briefly. Could you discuss the roles of both the African Union and the Arab League and all the things that we're talking about here this afternoon, and what do you anticipate it'll be in the near future?
Quickly, my experience is it's been uneven. The African Union, understandably, is worried about countries being split. There are only 2 African countries that have just 2 ethnic groups. Most of them have multiple ethnic groups. They're concerned about a contagion, as are the 9 neighbors. But I think now that they've understood the inevitability of this, they've played a more constructive role. The Arab League was unhelpful, as was the African Union, on questions of accountability, but they have been helpful on some of the development issues. And Qatar in particular should be singled out, and the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, al-Mahmoud, for their extraordinary leadership in trying to get constructive discussions going on Darfur. So could they have done more? Yes. Should they have done more? In my opinion, yes. Do we wish they'd done more? Absolutely. But they have made contributions, and more lately than they did a few years ago.
Thank you. And then finally, what can we do to ensure that the corruption, which is endemic in much of Africa, doesn't take root, although certainly there's already corruption in southern Sudan, but doesn't thrive in what may soon be Africa's newest country?
Transparency, transparency, transparency are your first three priorities. Second, good governance will require helping train a larger coterie of people to run the agencies and departments of a newly independent southern Sudan. And third, some good green eye shades from outside donors and others to try to monitor it. And ultimately, as Congressman Rohrabacher indicated, if there is in fact a democratic process of accountability, that is a useful and often determinative aspect in corruption fighting.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back, bounce my time.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you to, our panelists and great members. Tomorrow at 10:30 in this room, we will be having a briefing on China. And with that, this briefing is adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.
That wasn't too hard on you.